You're listening to a podcast from thespoilist.com. Warning, this podcast contains spoilers for Star Trek Into Darkness. You think your film is safe? It is an illusion, a comforting lie told to protect you. Enjoy these final moments of peace, for I have returned to make a podcast. So, shall we begin? Welcome to a First Contact special where we are going to be discussing Star Trek Into Darkness. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Alex.
Sadly, James can't be with us today because he didn't make bail. In this special, we are going to be talking about Star Trek Into Darkness in depth and with spoilers. As you might know if you listen to our regular intro cast, we are coming at this with quite different expectations and backgrounds. I am a Star Trek veteran, having seen the entire back catalogue. Alex, how are you coming at Star Trek Into Darkness?
Having started watching it as of this year with the J.J. Abrams film. So I've seen the recent J.J. Abrams film, I've seen the first 6 Star Trek films and some of the original series. But all of it very recently and all of it after the 2009 film.
So your first experience of Star Trek is basically the J.J. Abrams Star Trek universe.
That is exactly right, yes. So that will colour my perception quite heavily.
Very definitely. Now, this is your last chance to turn around here. There will be spoilers. This film probably gains quite a lot from you not knowing too much about it. So if you want to go, this is your last chance. Oh, you're still here, are you? Fine then. Okay, so Star Trek Into Darkness. Let's hear your opinion first, the newcomer to the franchise.
I really liked it. And I keep seeing reviews on both sides of the fence, and they're sort of both at quite strong extremes. People either really love it or really, really hate it. I mean, obviously, James Hunt has been quite vocal in his dislike of the film. But no, I really enjoyed it. It felt like a roller coaster ride, and it just didn't stop. It just pounded on through, and when you reach the end of it, I didn't feel that I'd been waiting for the end to come at any point.
Well, I might surprise you here, but when watching it, I felt exactly the same way. I was highly entertained. I didn't think it quite hit the heights of the greatest moments of the 2009 film, but I thought it was a really strong cinematic experience, and it was relentless. The pace was frenetic. But then I had a couple of niggles, and the niggles have sort of spread out, and they sort of become gripes, and the more I think about it, maybe the less I like this film. I think as a popcorn movie, it's great, but when you consider it in the overall canon of Star Trek, I certainly start to see some problems.
I think it's because I'm removed from the canon to a certain extent that I enjoyed it to the extent I did. I think I had less issues with it than I had with the 2009 film, actually. I thought it was a slightly more coherent whole. I felt like the reason for things happening was more logical than it had been at times in the 2009 film.
I can certainly understand that. I suppose the big spoiler in this is that the Benedict Cumberbatch character, referred to up to this point as John Harrison, is a fairly important figure from Star Trek's past, namely the genetic Superman from Space Seed and The Wrath of Khan. It's Khan.
And, you know, you have to say that the filmmakers were fairly relentless in trying to say that it wasn't Khan, and what else could they do, frankly? It's a shame, really, that it was out there. I mean, it wasn't helped, of course, by JJ saying on the commentary for the 2009 film, "Oh, we considered ending this film with the appearance of the Botany Bay." Oh, well, you've just given away what you're probably going to do in the next film there. I mean, imagine coming to this film with no idea that that might be the case. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people convinced themselves going in, okay, it probably isn't Khan. And I think when I went in, at the back of my mind, I still thought it could be. But I was at a point where I thought, well, actually, they could just be doing a whole new character, trying to forge off in a whole new path for the series. I was surprised, therefore, to find the film is so reverential to Wrath of Khan. I mean, really reverential to that film. But I enjoyed it. I do wonder how that would come across to anyone that hasn't seen Wrath of Khan, I have to say.
I also wonder how much this matters, because my feeling was, knowing Khan, knowing the entire backstory, was I thought there was a lot of assumed knowledge on behalf of the writers. I didn't think that the motivations of Khan were quite put out there. I didn't think the whole eugenics war backstory was really there. I didn't think they delved too much into what it was to be one of these supermen. And even the Botany Bay, as we've mentioned, didn't actually get shown. I could have done with Spock sitting and basically being Basil Exposition for a couple of minutes just to tell any new audience members exactly who Khan was and why he's actually important.
I think that the way they played it, it did require knowledge of it beforehand. However, I think from the script, what they were trying to do was tie the idea of Khan, if you hadn't seen Space Seed or Wrath of Khan, try it very much to assume knowledge about eugenics in the Second World War, in particular. From my memory of what the script was, it seemed to be playing on what people would know from that and just taking it at its most basic core. And yes, I suppose that could be a criticism, that it could have done with a bit more elaboration. But I think people are familiar enough with the idea of a super race and what that entails.
I think one of the issues I had in that case is, if you are stripping it back to basics, does this really need to be Khan? Or could John Harrison have been any bad guy? Do they really need to be reverential to Star Trek's past? Or could they go about just forging their own identity? They have to some extent. It is a different film. It is its own film. But I don't really know if they really needed to evoke Khan. I don't think it would have been any less powerful had it not been that character.
No. And in fact, the powerful things that required evoking Wrath of Khan were the playing on Spock's death by having Kirk die, to all intents and purposes, in this film. That was where it mattered more than the character being Khan. It's interesting, because yes, at the end of the 2009 film, you got the sense of, okay, they've set it up, and now they're forging ahead with a new path. But you get that feeling again at the end of this one. The closest thing that I can tie that into is the way that the Bond franchise has gone recently, where at the end of Casino Royale, you think, okay, they've set it up, it's going down a new path. And then Quantum of Solace comes along, okay, right, that's set straight afterwards, so it's now setting him up to go forward into a whole new line. And then you have Skyfall, and you assume, right, this is the new one. But it's the anniversary one, so what actually happens is you add the final step into setting it up for a whole new era by bringing in a new M and bringing back Moneypenny and whatnot. Spoilers for Skyfall. Oh, well, tough. And I kind of get the feeling that that's what they're trying to do with Into Darkness. They're trying to bring this version of Star Trek up to the point of them going on their 5-year mission. And to do that, yes, they're bringing back something from the past. Did they need to do that? Perhaps not, but I can understand why they might have thought they needed to.
I mean, I got the feeling from the ending of this film, it felt to me like the final scene for the pilot of a long-running TV show. And I suppose in some ways it is that. This point basically leads to the moment that the TV show begins, you know, with them, this crew, this all together. They've got the ship, it's all in shape. We now know Kirk's definitely captain and he's earned his place. We're going off on the 5-year mission. Let's have a whole bunch of standalone adventures. It's almost like this film is compensating for some of the decisions they made in Star Trek 2009.
And I don't think that should be underestimated because, you know, you've had success in 2009, but we're all too aware that you can have a good Star Trek film and then have an awful one. And I think there very much was a need for J.J. Abrams to take the success of the 2009 film and build upon that with a second one to move forward. I don't think... I can understand why you'd want to really try and consolidate on what you've already built up before moving off into new areas. There is a logic to what he's doing there. Whether you agree with that, of course, is a different matter, but you can certainly see why that would be important, and certainly important for the film studio.
I mean, we didn't know he was departing to go and run Star Wars, and I imagine Star Trek will remain within his production company, but it does very much not leave too many balls in the air. We have the Enterprise and the crew going off at the end, so it is pretty free for a new filmmaker to come in, put their own stamp on it, and tell whatever story that they really want to tell.
And you've got to say that's a great place to leave it in, really. You know, you can now bring in elements from the past if you so desire, but it's set it up perfectly now to do whatever. You can do something entirely original if you so desire. And I imagine that will be exactly the direction they go in. I can't really see them now doing anything more from the films. What I'd expect to see is the film series now follow a path very similar to the Star Trek game that's just come out, where you have Kirk and Spock and the Gorn. That's basically what it's revolving around. But they've done something entirely different with them. You know, it's not a remake of Arena in any way at all. It just happens to feature the Gorn. And I can imagine the films perhaps going down that path.
Almost every Star Trek film since Star Trek II has in some way been influenced it or tried to emulate it. Certainly the case with Nemesis, which was so desperately trying to be a homage to the Wrath of Khan. And even Star Trek 2009, you bring in the Kobayashi Maru, which was seen in the Wrath of Khan, and various elements. So hopefully now that we've done Khan again, a line can be drawn underneath that, and Star Trek can actually find its own voice.
I do think that that Khan is a character, because of the second film, that looms so large over the franchise that if you hadn't done it with this film, you would have had people continuing to ask, so when are you going to do Khan? Because you have the whole of the Star Trek timeline to play with, that would have been something that would have kept coming up. So I can understand also wanting to do that and move on.
Let's talk a little bit about the performance. I thought that Benedict Cumberbatch was absolutely brilliant. He was chilling, cold. The scenes I thought it worked best was when he's in the cage in the Hannibal Lecter style, taunting Kirk, basically trying to get the psychological edge over him. Very strong performance.
Yes, I thought that he managed to emulate what had gone before. Not at first, but it sort of came in more as the film went on. But he managed to also bring something new to it. And yes, as you say, a very sort of Hannibal Lecter air at points. But very, very chilling. And he really brought something special to that role. I think it's also worth us just addressing now, there has been a certain reaction to the fact that it's now known that he is playing Khan. At the same time, I sort of see that they're trying to cast someone to play the part rather than try and be entirely reverential to look. And
of course, Alice Eve is playing Carol Marcus. She was an important part in The Wrath of Khan, the mother of Kirk's son, and she was American in The Wrath of Khan. Strangely English here, quite controversial.
I have to say she was the weakest part of the film for me. I thought that her acting was not very good.
Yeah, it wasn't the best performance, and I thought it was incredibly shoehorned, her character. It was completely unnecessary for her to be there. All the scenes she was in, you would think basically any one of the Enterprise crew could have stood in. And especially in a film where, Chekhov and Sulu don't have a great deal to do, maybe one of them could have taken up her scenes.
Yes. Essentially they used her character as a sort of way of setting up the plot with her father. And she's also clearly there because of the Wrath of Khan tie-in, and that is the main reason. But yes, I didn't feel that she was essential, and to be honest with you, I really don't think it would have stood out to me as much if it weren't for the fact I just didn't think she was a very good actor.
Clearly, she's being introduced as a love interest for Kirk, and it seems that there is zero chemistry between her and Chris Pine.
I think there was zero chemistry between her and anyone else. I mean, she was very one note in this film. I mean, I've seen her in other things, and she was better. There's no way around it. I don't know what has happened here.
And also, just the scene in her underwear, completely gratuitous. It seems to me that was them basically, the studio saying, now we need to see a sexy lady in her pants at least once. And then they go, fine, we'll put that in there.
Yes, I'm almost certain that is the case. But then again, think back to the trailer for the 2009 film, and think of the shot of the green girl in her underwear as well. It's not as if it's something that wasn't in the previous film. It's perhaps more noticeable because of the context.
Yeah, I'm still not sure why she had to change it that exact second, but yeah.
I think the reason was to have that moment with her and Kirk turning around when he's not meant to, and setting up, there might be something with them in the future.
Definitely. So there are many elements from The Wrath of Khan. First time you're probably aware of it is when Spock's in the volcano, in what I thought was a pretty excellent opening sequence, where he say the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. It's a pretty classic Star Trek line. Not really delivered with as much gravitas as Leonard Nimoy might manage, but you know exactly where you are with the film at that point.
I'm not sure how much gravitas that you can give that line, of course, when you're meant to be in the middle of an exploding volcano.
Yeah. I've got to question, the practicality of that device. Why couldn't they just drop that in the volcano?
Yeah, that occurred to me as well.
It's all about the spectacle, of course. I do quite like the moment on the planet when things go wrong and they evoke the Prime Directive, which we've been talking about a bit in our Next Generation podcast. When the aliens see the Enterprise, they actually end up worshipping it as a god.
Well, and I like the fact that they did address those issues. I mean, Mark Kermode's review said, of course, that they addressed those issues and they did it very well. They just happened to be doing it while running down a corridor or while things were exploding around them. But I appreciated the fact that they weren't just glossed over, that there was the debate between Kirk and Spock as to, you shouldn't save my life. Well, yes, we should. And you had that back and forth, because it would have felt odd not to have that. I think if you're taking the original show, and obviously the films as well, and trying to update it, that's the most important thing to keep.
Now, there's one moment in this film that I thought was just incredibly self-indulgent and unnecessary, and that's the appearance of Leonard Nimoy. I'm not sure why he was there.
Yes, I agree. Although I did like what they did there, I have to admit. When he first appeared, I thought, okay, so we've got Nimoy. He's probably going to crop up in the films for a little while because we've got Nimoy. We've set up the fact he's in the universe, so that's we'll bring him in. However, I like the fact that what they did was to have essentially Nimoy tell them the ending of the film, and then to have the younger Spock try and play out events that way, only to find out that Khan wasn't going to allow him to. I like the way that they set the audience up to think, okay, we're going to go down this road, and then, oh no, it's down something entirely different.
Other elements, I suppose, brought in from Star Trek lore include the Klingons, which, a bit like Carol Marcus, slightly shoehorned into the plot. Khan beams to Klingon to escape after his terrorist attacks on Earth in an abandoned province to set up an action set piece on Kronos.
I didn't have a problem with it as the film was playing out. I sort of went along with the lines that were presented about, oh, well, of course, that's somewhere that we can't go. And that seemed to make sense in my mind. When I think about it, Khan's reasonings for being on Kronos are perhaps a little more vague. You can sort of explain it away, say maybe it's a hit and run while he tries to work out what he's going to do next or something else along those lines. I'd have to see the film again, I have to be honest. But it wasn't something that bothered me at the time, I have to say. I just went along with it. I enjoyed the update to their look. I mean, they don't get a great deal of screen time, but I suppose what you need is a reasonably formidable threat to Khan to play out the fact that he's, a super soldier essentially. So bringing in a warrior race, I guess that makes sense. I mean, it's no surprise that they're in this film. JJ has said before that he wanted to have them in, and of course, there were scenes with Klingons originally intended to go into the 2009 film.
If you were doing a checklist of what you would put in a rebooted Star Trek sequel, the Klingons would definitely pretty much be top of your list. And maybe it's a shame that they seem a little underused in this film, but I suspect that they'll be back. What the modern Star Trek films are doing is very much taking all the icons of Star Trek and using them in some way, sometimes a surprising way, but I would say they're a pretty integral part of the universe.
Yes, I would expect to see them back fairly soon. And the way the story plays out in this film suggests that War with the Klingons, there will be some event fairly imminently. And Marcus's actions have sped that up somewhat, I would imagine. If they're going to go down that route, that's probably how it will play out. Of course, you've got the crew off on the 5-year mission now, so who knows? As we said before, this film and the last film are very much setting up the universe in its new state. And I think that has been the big surprising thing for a lot of people. The fact that the second film is also setting up the universe the same as the first film has.
Yeah. I mean, one big issue with that was a lot of people said it was completely implausible that Kirk was made captain from being a cadet and then given the Enterprise after a pretty small event. And to be fair to them, the writers have chosen to address that in this film.
Yes, and they pick up on various points from that film, including Spock's feelings about Vulcan being destroyed. And they're all sort of things that I was expecting maybe would have just sort of briefly had a mention. But actually, no, they do play out those ideas and the consequences that they have. Which is good to see, that there is some ongoing narrative, as well as having, reasonably isolated films.
And one of the important elements from the first film was Christopher Pike, the last captain of the Starship Enterprise. He acted very much as a father figure to Kirk. Now, in The Wrath of Khan, there is a lot of backstory between the characters, so there is a personal dimension. In this film, they're trying to create that personal connection between Kirk and Khan with the death of Captain Pike. I don't think they quite earn the same depth of backstory, because I think Khan could have been fighting any starship, really. Kirk wasn't really an important factor, but they've gone some way to address that connection.
Yes, I mean, the hard thing with the character of Kirk in this new timeline is the fact that there aren't a great deal of people that you can do that with. Really, aside from Spock, it is only Pike that you can claim that strong connection with. I think it's purely just down to the fact that prior to this we've had one film to set it up, and because of the character's backstory, it makes it harder. So you have to play on that idea of Pike being the one who made him realise what he should be doing and act as that father figure, and in this film give him a second chance. You know, they at least do have that element into the film. It's a tough one. I think they did the best that they could there with, you know, what was on hand.
And I suppose that brings us to the big finale in some ways, because the thing I felt was the Wrath of Khan, the ending, Spock's death, is probably the emotional high point in all of Star Trek. You know, it is highly affecting. Here, I'm not sure they've really earned it. They play out the same scene, essentially, with the death of Kirk. I don't think it quite hits the emotional highs. Never at any point did I think he's staying dead.
No, but then knowledge of Wrath of Khan would also affect that. But also, second film in a reboot, I wouldn't have expected them to kill off either one of the leads anyway. Whereas with Wrath of Khan, you have that prior history with the original series, so I could imagine them doing it. I know technically, you know, in this new timeline, nothing's off limits, as the destruction of Vulcan showed. But yeah, I wouldn't have expected him to die. And I think there'd be very few people who didn't see the way it was going with the whole Tribble coming back to life. Oh, that's convenient. But yeah, I mean, if you're going down that path, that's the way it's going to go when you're evoking it. I did think it was an interesting dynamic to play out with the other way round, and having essentially Spock's emotions come through. That was an interesting element.
I think what they're trying to demonstrate is, no matter the timeline, the friendship between Kirk and Spock is a constant, that they would do the same things for each other. They would both sacrifice their lives for each other, which is the question posed at the very start of the film. Would he do the same for you? And the answer is, of course, a resounding yes, but you probably only get that answer if you know Star Trek's past.
Yes, and I mean, as we said, it's interesting to think how this would play out if you've never seen Wrath of Khan. How would this come across? Because there is such a strong element of, I see what they're doing there. They're reversing it round. But I don't know about you, but I certainly took joy from seeing how reversing the roles around changed the way it played out.
I have to say, I do think that scene is so nicely played. The way that Kirk knocks out Scotty in the same way that Spock took out McCoy right before he goes into the chamber. You know, you can't go in there. There is a lot of joy in seeing that. I did have a real smile on my face. I kind of prefer the simplicity in the Wrath of Khan, rather than making it into a big Galaxy Quest style action sequence where he's got to kick the warp core in, but very nicely played character moments.
I think that's one of those things about, you know, the fact that these are very different types of films to those original Star Trek films. These are much more in sort of the Star Wars end of things, let's be honest. So kicking the warp core is much more in line with this kind of film. I have to say though, while I enjoyed that element, and I wouldn't want to see it every film, but I can enjoy it in this one. I can see that doing a reversal on this whole scenario would really annoy a lot of people that are hardcore fans, and I'm I haven't read too many reviews, but I'm guessing that a fair amount of the negative ones will be making a similar sort of point.
The thing is, they can't really win, because they are paying the fans great service, they are paying Star Trek great service, they obviously have a lot of respect for the source material, so much so that you might say, well, they're basically just ripping it off. It's very much an echo of the Wrath of Khan. But if they were to ignore the Star Trek legacy, I imagine they would come in for a lot of criticism from other circles. So with such a huge fan base and such a large back catalogue, I'm not sure there's anything they could do to please everyone, essentially.
No, absolutely not. And I'm expecting it to be a very similar case with Star Wars Episode 7. It's a fine line to tread. You're never going to please everyone. I think, you have to applaud them that they have managed to please such a good cross-section of newcomers and old school fans. And I personally, I think that the way they've done it in this film was a good idea, providing that you use the last film and this film as a way of setting up the future. I think that makes perfect logical sense. And I do think that the ending really does rely a lot, or it relied for me anyway, on having seen Wrath of Khan. However, if I try and just separate it in my mind and try and think, well, how would it have come across if I'd never seen that film? It's not as if it would be unwatchable. It would play out in a different way, and have a different kind of tension to it. But I don't think it would make the film lesser for anyone necessarily. I just think you'd get something different out of it.
I mean, talking about Star Trek 2009, I thought there were some nice visual cues there. The opening sequence, you've got them jumping off a cliff, which obviously you had with the young James Kirk sending his car off a cliff. You've got the repeat of the sequence on Vulcan, but doing it horizontally instead of vertically. There's quite a few touches that certainly show these go together. These two films very much play out. Well, they'd be a pretty great double bill. As sequels go, they are very much connected to each other. The bar scene as well between Kirk and Pike as well, which is evoked again.
Yes, I mean, and to draw the Bond comparison again, these two films go together in my mind in the same way that Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace go together. I know that's a controversial comparison because a lot of people don't like Quantum of Solace, but it's just in my mind, it's that same sort of thing that I can see one playing into the next one. As you say, watching a double bill in the cinema would work in a perfect manner, especially because in the last film you had the antagonism between Kirk and Spock running throughout it for such a long time, and it's rounded off at the end of the film, and you see that actually, no, I don't think you're as bad as I first thought you were. But you get the resolution to that in this film.
Very much so. It is establishing the depth of their friendship. If we're making cinematic comparisons of good double bills, I see it quite like Back to the Future, which all three of those films use very similar visual cues and callbacks to the first one and play out a lot of similar scenes again. And I think it's doing that. And actually, when I saw Star Trek 2009, I thought it was the closest thing. I think if I was 5 years old, that would be my sort of Back to the Future film, which was my gateway into all science fiction. I think that's the only film of recent times, the new Star Trek, which probably serves the same function for this generation of kids.
It's probably the first, possibly since The Phantom Menace. If we're talking about sort of that end of science fiction rather than sort of in the comic book end, or in the end of Transformers, and God help any child that comes into any kind of sci-fi interest from Transformers. But yeah, probably the first since The Phantom Menace. Is this a bad time to go on record and say, I think The Phantom Menace gets a bad rep?
Like, you would have been the right age at The Phantom Menace, though.
I hear all the time people saying, yeah, Jar Jar, no one liked Jar Jar, even the kids didn't like Jar Jar, and they did like Jar Jar, because I was 8 or 9 at the time, and I remember they did, and I remember the huge amount of merchandise that everyone would have had at school of Jar Jar. I remember the backpacks, the lunch boxes, and it's almost become a cliche to say people can't separate in their minds how they would have felt at the time watching those original films at their right age and watching them now. But in my experience, that is exactly the case. And I found by episode 3, I'd sort of passed the age, and I was watching that thinking, this is terrible.
It's quite curious, because in, I think it was 1997, when they did the re-release of the special editions of Star Wars in the cinema.
Yeah, it was.
And I was 14. And me and my friend went to see Star Wars. And we came out, and we just went, was that it? I guess having seen, you know, all the films inspired by Star Wars and seen a whole generation, it doesn't have the same impact that it might have done had that been the first magical thing we'd seen, maybe even at a younger age. We thought it was good, but it didn't seem to change the cinematic world for us.
No. And coming back to Star Trek, I think that these films that we have now will do a much better job of appealing to a younger audience than the ones that have gone before. But I think that the joy of them is that they do have an appeal to an audience that is older than that. As I say, the problem that I had with the Star Wars prequels is that I was growing up, and between the course of episode 1 and episode 3, I had passed the point of interest, I think, really. But I think the Star Trek films at the moment are doing a much better job. You know, it's down to various elements. It's down to a good story, or at least an interesting story, good pacing, and I mean, that's something that should not be underestimated. And fundamentally, I think the actors are good at playing the parts, and the characters are likeable. Alice Eve aside, and I mean, a lot of comment has been made on Simon Pegg playing Scotty in this film, and I've seen quite a lot of Star Trek fans saying they just don't like it, and what was the one that I saw? Someone saying the film opened and I saw Simon Pegg gurning at a fish and I knew all hope was lost. I think that's quite an extreme reaction to have, really. They're playing Scotty differently in this, in this new timeline, but is that an issue, really? Okay, they've found a slightly different dynamic to go with.
Yeah, it plays very well with mainstream audiences, and I think even most fans. I mean, at the screening I was at, Scotty got a lot of big laughs, so I don't think it's playing badly. And also, are we saying that, James Doohan's was one of the great performances and that he wasn't ever gurning? I think people have perhaps built up Star Trek's past to be a lot better acted than it really was.
Yes, I think that's very much the case, and it's not, only in this film series. I think Star Wars has a very similar problem, to be perfectly honest. But, it's worth remembering, these aren't the same actors. They may be playing the same characters, although, albeit at different times in their lives, but they are different actors, and if you try and make them an absolute carbon copy of what went before, it would be the most horrendous of parodies. It would be awful. Chris Pine and Zachary Quinto do a very, very good job of emulating William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, playing those characters, while also doing something a little different with them. And it has to be said, those are the two where it's most essential. Because they're the ones that people are going to be focused on. And I suppose McCoy as well. But they aren't carbon copies. They have certain elements. Chris Pine manages to get that sort of Shatner cockiness into his performance quite well. But if you watch them side by side, you wouldn't say they were the same. And yet I think they're very strong performances. I really do think it matters less when you get to Scotty and Chekhov and Uhura and anyone else. It's it's not an issue for me. If you can find something interesting to do with them, that means they're not just, relegated to the background. That's the film I want to see, frankly.
It is very interesting, because you would say, Chekhov, Sulu, Uhura, to some degree, Scotty, they're very one-note characters in the original series. They don't have a backstory. They don't really have an awful lot to do. What can you say about Scotty is he's Scottish, he likes to drink, and he's a good engineer. And that's it. There's a lot of blank space to play with there. And it is good that all the characters actually, for the most part, do have something to do.
There are, of course, periods where they go without much to do. Chekhov is relegated to engineering for a while. Although in some senses then when he does have the scenes, it allows him to come into his own a bit more. We go for a long period without Scotty, but that is tied into the plot, so again you can forgive that. It is a large cast, which is hard to do. You're always going to be concentrating on the main two, if not the main three.
And again, even with that, there were some nice nods to Star Trek, with Sulu getting to sit in the captain's chair, a hint that ultimately by Star Trek VI, Sulu had become a Starfleet captain. So it is using what we know about the characters already and fleshing it out a little bit. And actually, for the first time in this film, which I don't think we got in the last film, there's certainly a lot more interplay with that Kirk, Spock, McCoy dynamic. Some people thought Uhura had kind of replaced McCoy, but I think there's some nice back and forths between these characters, which very much is reminiscent of how they acted in the original series and movies.
Yes, and there was some very obvious ties in terms of dialogue, where they were trying to tie in McCoy from the original series and films to this McCoy. Damn it, Jim! I'm a doctor, not a God. What was it? An engineer? Which is obviously the biggest tie-in that you could do. Although to as we've talked about before, a mainstream audience in the cinema that I saw it in at midnight, that got a big cheer. I can imagine that a lot of longer-term fans would see that and go, "Oh God!" But
yeah, and the postmodernism of Kirk telling him, "Can you stop with the metaphors already?" I thought that was a very nice touch, to be honest.
Yes, no, so did I. I thought it trod that line quite well, in that you have that line, like the one that we said from McCoy, which got a big cheer from mainstream audience, because, something we recognise. But it also had the more obscure things for the fans, like Sulu saying, I could get a taste for this, and whatnot.
Yeah, and little things, a treble playing a pretty essential part in the plot as well.
Yeah, who saw that one coming?
But I thought that was somewhat clunkily handled. There's no way you didn't see it. Actually, if we go back a bit to if we talk about Doctor Who, do you remember in the end of season 4 with the Doctor's hand, where they suddenly had this big shot of the Doctor's hand before it came in, really useful to the plot? And
yeah,
in the same way, it was, my God, Kirk's dead, and there was this massive treble in the shot. I think we'd already established that Khan had magic blood right at the start of the film.
Yes, I agree. In the opening scene with Noel Clarke's brief performance, I did very much watch that and go, oh, it's Noel Clarke. Oh, that's the end of Noel Clarke. Is there more? No, that is the end of Christ. He got a raw deal. But again, I think it's always worth keeping in mind that they are trying to appeal to a younger audience at the same time. And it's that difficulty of trying to get into the mindset of someone who's 9. And if you have that set up at the beginning of the film, is it something that still plays on a 9-year-old's mind in the way that it does for you or I? You know, I mean, we watch it and we see, and we're immediately looking for, Okay, well that doesn't seem to be tied into too much, so that's obviously plot resolution there. Yeah, it's interesting. And I think moments like that stand out more when you're consciously trying to appeal to a younger audience.
Maybe the problem with modern science fiction is that there are a bunch of adult fanboys getting annoyed about something that is really for children.
Yes. Yeah, that that is that perennial problem, really, isn't it?
Quickfire.
Don't worry, we have not been shot by the Klingons. That sound effect can only mean we're having a quickfire round where we'll discuss some of the points that we've not got round to so far. Khan! Great to see Spock delivering that line.
That I can imagine lots of people who are long-time fans of the series going, oh, God, really? But in the midnight screening I saw, and I have to say, most people at that midnight screening weren't, in my area anyway, I don't think they were long-time fans. Most of them that I heard talking were people who'd come to it with the 2009 film, and that got a big cheer.
I mean, that is the one thing about Star Trek that is really known. It is completely out there. So you have to put it in. It's almost a punch the air moment for me, because Zachary Quinto, he really delivers it. He is doing the Phil Shatner. It is different, but it is very much, it's a pretty echoed moment.
When you've got that added element of, it's Spock showing emotion, which is what makes that reversal interesting. That you can do that, and you're getting a bit more of an insight into his character in something that's set up in the middle of the film when they're on Kronos. New warp effect.
Oh, it's pretty.
It is nice, isn't it? I mean, there's no consistency from film to film, but it's nice.
Yeah, well, you've not had consistency from the original series to the movies to the Next Generation, so it's changed enough times, but it's very cool.
That is true.
Nurse Chapel, she gets a mention. She's not on the Enterprise. Probably a role that a lot of people thought Alice Eve was playing before they revealed it. She's a friend of Carol Marcus and has left the Enterprise due to Kirk doing something bad to her.
I can't say that I was aware of that. I didn't take that in. Interesting that so much of the end of the film is in the trailer, and in many ways, I felt that was a shame. And I think what they were trying to do with that trailer was show the film to be quite earthbound, whereas in reality it's not. And all of the things in advance with people concerned that it would be largely earthbound, I think those really came to nothing. But it's a shame that so much of the end of the film is in the promotion. I mean, because essentially you're giving away the big ending with the crashing or the near crashing of the Enterprise. Yeah,
it's very strange. The marketing all did make this look like it was going to be a very dark film, both in terms of colour and of content, and it is just nothing like that at all. It is a space adventure, which is strange. I'm not quite sure why they went down that road, but it's clearly been successful. It's generated a lot of conversation, but it is a shame that Pike's funeral, essentially, and the big bad confrontation on Earth is given away.
I think the reason for doing it purely was to make it stand out compared to the previous Star Trek film, which was very space and alien planet based. And so to have in this trailer, hey look, Earth, you're interested in that, aren't you? Look, it's London. I think that was probably the thought that was going through their minds. Title, how do you feel that sits with the film now you've seen it in its entirety? Because Star Trek Into Darkness, no, Star Trek into sort of light, frothy space romp, really.
I'm very confused by the title, because it did take them a long time to announce it, and obviously it went through many permutations, but I would have thought the title of this film should have been Star Trek Vengeance.
Star Trek Wrath of Khan 2.
Well, even if they'd sort of echoed that title, in some way, but Star Trek Into Darkness doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't particularly make any sense to me.
I mean, I like the title. I just, having seen the film, it bears no relevance to the final product.
I think they wanted a Star Trek title that didn't have a colon, so they wanted to make it sort of a single phrase.
Yes, apparently that's exactly what they were trying to do, according to JJ on Kermo de Meo's film review.
Section 31, they were Starfleet's secret intelligence organization introduced in Deep Space Nine. Their leader was played by William Sadler. It was then brought back in Enterprise. Here we've got some more references to it. The archive blown up in London was actually a Starfleet intelligence base run by Section 31. So there, again, another nod to the fans that probably a lot won't even get.
Including me. Did you feel that the final defeat of Khan was satisfying? Because I've seen some people debate that just having Uhura saying, no, we need him, and then Spock delivering that blow that knocks him out wasn't enough, and they would have liked to have seen a final end to him. Whereas, where they've gone down the route of freezing him, which incidentally I think makes sense, because you're trying to show the fact that the crew are compassionate and that they aren't just killers in the way that that Khan might be. I think that's the way you have to go. I think it could also be very much setting it up for a return in the future if they so desired to go down that path. But did you feel that the final end of Khan was satisfying in this film?
Well, I don't want to see any more fights on platforms, really, which was what happened at the last couple of Next Generation films. They all seem to have exactly the same ending, with the captain fighting one big bad alien, and it was kind of boring. And they did that actually in Star Trek 2009 as well. In some ways, I was fine with it, because I think that the big defeat was actually taking down Vengeance, and, you know, you've got the technology. It was a big set piece, but I don't really want to see Spock beating someone up, especially. I don't think that's particularly Spock, even if he's mad at the death of his friend. I'm fine with Uhura beaming in and shooting him, because basically, a lot of the time I'm thinking, you've got a transporter, you've got a shuttle, why don't you use it? So they use it here, I'm fine. Putting him back in the freezer, it's very much like an old Batman kind of trope. It's, let's put the big bad in Arkham Asylum. He'll be back at some point, you would imagine, around Star Trek 4 or 5 if we get there. But I was fine with it. I didn't really think there was anything wrong with that, because I didn't think that was the emotional conclusion to the film. That had already been. It was a formality to take down Khan, really.
Some very strong similarities throughout this with Star Wars, right down to the flying the ship through the small gap, and we're not going to fit. That is so very much like The Empire Strikes Back. It's unbelievable. Somebody
recently did a bit of a showreel comparing shots from Star Wars and Star Trek 2009. You're going to get a lot of that with J.J. Abrams, and I think, you know, he'll fit quite well into Star Wars, but if you're making lots of references to Star Trek, the odd Star Wars one doesn't really matter too much either.
I think it's inevitable, to be honest, that those two franchises are going to become slightly more similar as time goes on. It's just the way of cinema.
Well, it is the language of cinema. It's the language of science fiction cinema, really, since Star Wars. And you might argue that the Star Trek films were a bit more cerebral, but the only reason they exist, these Star Trek movies, is because Paramount saw an opportunity after the success of Star Wars.
And, of course, I think there's certain elements to keep in mind about budget limitations and whatnot that I think affected Star Trek more than Star Wars to a large extent, which then are reflected in the kind of stories that you tell.
The Enterprise, I don't think its corridors have ever been bigger and more elaborate. You get a real sense of scale that this is a massive ship. A lot of people complained about the brewery standing in for engineering in the last film. Now engineering does have a more elaborate set, but also all the corridors are quite big and open, filled with people. It seems the Enterprise is a pretty big ship these days.
Yes, they really convey that well in this film. And, of course, with the whole sequence with the Enterprise falling back to Earth, you get to use all of that brilliantly. I thought the whole sequence with the shifting centre of gravity was great. Really brought home the scale of the Enterprise and that it can be a dangerous place.
Peter Weller as Admiral Marcus. This is not his first appearance in Star Trek. He played a xenophobe in Star Trek Enterprise who basically wanted to shut down the Federation and get all of the aliens away from Earth. Basically an interstellar Nigel Farage.
Big crash at the end in San Francisco. Lots of buildings destroyed. Spaceship roars through. Think about how many people would have been killed there. Because it's not really dwelt upon, very much, because we have to move on to big fight with Khan, but a lot of death there.
Quite a significant amount of death, but this is how modern blockbusters work. Nobody ever really feels like they're killing anyone. The only actions that have consequences are the ones we're directly watching. I suppose you don't really want to put a downer too much on the end of the film. We do have Pike's funeral or Pike's memorial service there, but they cut away from that pretty quickly. Space, the final frontier. I kind of felt it was a bit of a cheat letting Leonard Nimoy do that in the last film. I felt, well, he's there, you've got to give it to him. But I felt if you're putting Kirk on the Enterprise, really he should be saying that. But I suppose this time it's saying he's the captain of the Enterprise. This is his universe. We're going off on adventures. Just like we were saying before, this is where the adventure really begins, I suppose.
I found it interesting that they chose to use that version of the speech, actually.
Where they say no one?
No one instead of no man, yes. I mean, there's nothing to read into it particularly. You go with one or the other, and obviously, compared to the 60s, where no one has gone before sounds better. I mean, obviously what's originally implied is mankind, but, yeah. Just when there's so many other ties into the original series and whatnot, it's just interesting that was different.
Maybe I need to watch this again, but I felt Pine's performance there might not have had the gravitas it might have done. It was fine, but I think going from that quite intense funeral scene and cutting away as it did, it maybe needed a little bit more power. It was fine, but I don't know. It seemed to be lacking a little something for me. I really liked the shots of inside the Enterprise, but I don't know. It didn't seem quite as powerful as that delivery's been in the past, maybe.
Yes, perhaps it didn't have the oomph. I think perhaps a large part of that is also just down to how much bass you have in the voice of the person that's delivering it, and that maybe Chris Pine's voice doesn't have quite that bassy feel to it that Nimoy's had in the last film, for example. But no, it was nice to see Kirk having that speech. There is no way around that.
Yeah, and I probably don't really want to see that again in the next film. I think we've done that now, so...
Oh, you know it's going to be in there.
It's so much. I mean, they didn't do that in the original films. They did it after Spock died, but it does very much seem you have to have every single one of the Star Trek icons in the films. If they do it, I'd quite like them to do it right at the start and basically pretend it's a TV show and do an opening sequence that way.
I could imagine them doing that, actually.
The next film is going to be the 50th anniversary movie. It's scheduled for 2016. And I mean, you've got to imagine they'll do something pretty special for that. This one, of course, was harkening back to Star Trek's past in a huge number of ways. But you would expect them to do something like that for the 50th anniversary. And I don't know if they might go down the sort of Days of Future Past kind of route. Maybe bring in Star Trek Super Team from various series. That would be incredibly fanish. Or do they just want to go out on their own? I think we've paid enough homage to the past and maybe just have a proper Star Trek film.
I think the sad thing is that this would have worked very well as that anniversary film.
Quite similar to Skyfall, I would say. It does pay homage to the past while looking to the future. It does put everything in place. So
Yeah.
it is a shame they've done this movie at this time, because I don't want another movie like that. I would rather this crew had their own adventures on their own terms.
Yeah, I mean, and the comparison to Skyfall was running through my mind the entire time watching the film. The thing of having a new story, but bringing in such strong elements from the past, unashamedly. My gut feeling is that they'll probably take a similar approach to it that Doctor Who's taking to its 50th, which obviously we don't know entirely what approach it's taking. We just get a sense. So they have Tennant back in that, but Moffat has said quite regularly that he wants to be looking forward rather than just looking back, and I imagine that's how they'll approach the anniversary film. Would they bring someone back? I would be surprised, unless they can sort of conceive of a way of shoehorning Shatner in. But I know it was discussed before. I know Abrams has said that they had thought about it, but I can't see it happening now, to be honest.
No, the scene described actually in the Star Trek 2009, which would have incorporated William Shatner, I thought actually sounded rather nice, where it's a hologram that Spock gives to the younger Spock to describe how their friendship is. It's a message that he sent. And I don't think that would have been any more indulgent than Spock's appearance in this film, really. But I can see why they didn't do that by the same token. Well, thank you for listening to our exploration of Star Trek Into Darkness. If you enjoyed this, then normal service will resume very soon, when we will be looking once again at Star Trek The Next Generation in our intro cast. You can find that on iTunes, and if you like it, please leave us a review. So until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.